Today is the second part of the book, and it's the third class. We only have one class left, so hang in there. Come back next week for the final wrap-up. I'm going to be covering part 3 and 4 of the book in one class. And so there's 3 vices and virtues each time, and then in the final part of the book, I talk about something called a rule of life, which is kind of, I'm excited to share that with you. It's this idea that you can build. A rule of life is a word that's taken from the word trellis. And you know how a trellis will keep vines and flowers that you want to grow, it'll keep them out of the dirt so they can climb up, heavenward, and they can not get all decomposed and stuff on the ground. So a rule of life is like a trellis for our lives in a spiritual sense, that you create habits that you want to do daily, and then weekly and monthly, and then each year. And people develop these in their ways of living in the desert. They had a rule of life together. There would be times of work, times of prayer, times of fellowship, times of church and worship. And they all knew what was coming next. But we don't live in a community, so we don't have those types of things. But I wanted to show in the back of the book that you can take pieces that mean something to you. Perhaps it's scripture reading or prayer or fellowship or being out in nature and seeing God's creation, that you can kind of add those. And I'm going to hand out a sheet next week where you can kind of decide, how do you want your life to go? It doesn't have to be haphazard. You can have a rule of life where you kind of count on certain practices and certain ways of being in the world that draw you closer to God in a more organized way. And I think that's something from these monastic communities that we're taught right off the bat, that having a way of life that is intentional, that is specific, helps bring us closer to God and leads us away from the temptations that are going to pull at us. So here we go with the next piece of the book is it's part 2, and it really starts on page 83. And it starts off with Moses. So the 3 things we're going to talk about today are the next 3, the temptations of the mind. These come after the temptations of the body, which are the first things that trip us up if we're trying to be disciplined, or for the desert fathers and mothers. As they're in the desert, the things of the body bother them first, like things relating to food, things relating to sex, things relating to keeping for yourself and finding your own provision instead of God's provision. And then the next thing, once you get those under control, these ones can kind of pop up. So maybe there's something brewing under the surface that's been bothering you. And that's where wrath can come in. And acedia, we'll get to that. That's a weird sounding word that we're not used to. We'll get to that. And then despondency, which is also, sometimes it was called sadness, but I don't think that goes far enough. And of course, we can all be sad. That there's nothing wrong with being sad. Sometimes it would be healthy if you're sad at times. And if you were never sad, that would be unhuman of you. So we'll talk about that. But the despondency is a little different, and I want to make sure we can tell the difference. And so if anybody has read the story of Moses, I would love to hear any of your comments about what you think about his story. And I'm not going to get into it in too many details, because I don't want to spoil it for you if you haven't read it yet. His is a fascinating story. Did anybody read this part of the book and have anything to say about it? Yeah, Jane? Oh, hang on for your sister first. Okay.
I just was impressed with how he went from one extreme of behavior to the other.
Yeah.
It was just inspiration.
Yeah, I felt like that too. Yeah. Steve, did you want to say something?
No, he probably forgot.
This chapter, be angry and sin not.
Yeah, be angry and sin not. Yeah. So just as a little tidbit teaser, Moses was. I mentioned this in the very first class. If you didn't come to that, you wouldn't have heard this. But Moses was kidnapped as a little kid, as a real little boy, and he was put into slavery in Alexandria. That would have been upsetting enough, be separated from your family as a really young child. But he really chose a path of wrath and all the other vices. All the vices, he really had them. and that's why when he decides to turn his life around, his spiritual father tries to talk him out of it at first, because it's just so hard. This type of life is maybe the hardest kind. And he wasn't willing to lead any kind of life as normal. He wanted to completely turn it around and turn it over to God and be devoted to God forever. And he knew it was going to be hard, but he cried for days until they allowed him to stay in the community. And then they accepted him as a brother. And his story, but then he goes, and I don't know that I did put this in the book, but one of the things he does to make sure he is obedient to God and becoming more humble, because this was a problem for him. He was a really big guy, he was really strong, and he got his way. He could muscle his way in, he could bully his way in. And so he knew, and they were telling his spiritual followers, like, you need humility, serve your brothers. So he would go out all night, walk to the cistern where they had water, and he would carry back water to refill for his brothers' containers of water that they would have outside their doors. So he almost never slept. He would just walk and bring back water for them as an act of obedience and as an act of service to the brothers, to learn how to serve, how to be humble, how to not be the big boss that gets your way all the time. This is just, it's one of the most extreme transformations that I have read about, where someone goes from being completely degenerate lifestyle, extremely criminal, and then turns it around. It becomes extremely beloved and known for peacefulness, as a patron saint of pacifism in the East. And I thought this was a really great, this is like a color page for little kids, and you could color it with all different colors. I thought that was a really cool little art page. And so when we think of anger, we know that Jesus got angry in the Bible. So it's not like anger isn't a human emotion that can happen, that would be normal to happen. The problem isn't anger. It's what happens, after that point of anger. Or if you store anger, it has a terrible shelf life. It poisons you, and you expel this poison on other people. And so I'm sure we've all known people who have an anger issue. My parents would say, I have a bad temper back in the day. And that meant you were going to get it. Stuff was going to come down on you. And so I wanted to read this too, because we have the benefit now of some brain scans, MRI functional brain scans, that shows what does anger look like in the brain? And how do we have these emotions? How do they come about? So I wanted to read this on page 90, just as a way to, I talk about this a little bit in my first book, the Wild Land Within, but this really changed my thinking completely. We tend to think situations elicit emotions in us, and like, you made me angry, or this made me angry, and that thing caused the other thing. But brain science tells us something much different, that it's our expectations, it's our previous experiences, and the pattern recognition of our brain that basically is the architect for our emotions. It comes from us and how we've interpreted our surroundings. So a person like Moses, who grew up angry and wrathful and revenge, full of revenge, had this automatic. This is how it would be automatic. And so you can be changed, but it takes all these new experiences, all these new disciplines to change how your brain is actually structured. So I just want to read this a little bit, because I thought this can change you. Because people say, and I've said the same sorts of things. Oh, I'm an angry person, or I'm an anxious person, or whatever it might be. But really, those are just emotions you're experiencing. They're not you. There's something that you're joining up with, that you can be reactive and not responsive. You can wind up thinking that's part of you, instead of that's something separate that I can reflect on and pick differently. So I wanted to just read a little bit about brain science and see if this might shift your thinking a little. So recent neuroscientific discoveries find something surprising about all emotions, including anger. Emotions are not what happens in response to a situation. And I think that's what most of us think, how we interpret that. Instead, the brain creates emotions based on our past experiences and current stimuli. Our bodies sense, so it's also stuff we're receiving through our bodies. Like, and if anybody's ever been like traumatized, and there was a certain smell in the air, or there was a certain, that smell can just put you right there in that spot, and that you go right back to your trauma, and that's your brain recognizing that pattern, right? So based on our past experiences and current stimuli our body sense, our brain predicts our emotions as our body senses the situation. So we think, this is going to make me mad. It made me mad last time. So you think about driving, someone cuts you off. Well, if you're used to yelling about that, if you're used to being upset about that, that's what's going to happen. Your brain's going to be like, yeah, that's the thing that makes me mad. But if you begin to say, well, not this time, when something happens, I'm going to think differently. Your brain will begin to predict differently. You'll begin to act differently. And this is all about, this really feeds into the thing I'm most interested in, which is spiritual formation. How do we transform from the people we are and the situations that have maybe injured us into Christ-likeness, into forgiving, gracious people, maybe graceful too. So our brain predicts emotions as our body senses our situation, and our brain tries to match the interpretation of the present situation we're sensing. It doesn't necessarily match reality. It just matches our prediction and to what it already knows. So this is why people will respond, even people in the same family can respond completely differently to something happening. Something might happen and one person might get so upset. Another person might be like, oh wow, that gives me something to think about. We can, even in the same family, have different responses to stuff that happens because our brain is predicting what we're going to feel. And so as I kind of metabolize that information, I tried to change my ways of thinking and being to respond and reflect before reacting. I used to be, Tim could tell you the horror stories, I'm sure, just so much more reactive, such a reactive person, and assuming things that weren't not necessarily matching reality, but I was kind of coming from a wounded place, an abusive childhood, and so things were a threat. Everything's a threat, so my brain was predicting that, and it wasn't necessarily matching reality. And so there's a part in the book that talks about dragons, wine, and angels' bread. Do we have any top students here who knows what this relates to? Anybody want to venture a guess? Evagrius speaks about dragon's wine as being wrath and anger. That's, if you can imagine like a drunk, fiery dragon, it's like that's something you're going to want to tangle with, right? But angel's bread came as a surprise to me because I would think, well, isn't the opposite of wrath and anger like peacefulness, calmness? But angel's bread is about meekness. And this is the idea that this is what angels eat. this is what makes them meek. And what meek means is not, it doesn't mean like this combo word of mild and weak. And that's what meek is. No, meek is strength under control, power and strength under control. And Jesus was the Prince of Peace and meek. He was meek and lowly in heart. He didn't lord it over anybody. If anybody could, he could. And he was not here to lead his disciples, but to serve them. So he does these slave-related things when he washes the feet. And he's showing them, I'm not the big boss man you're used to in your different scenarios in your life. I'm here to serve you. I'm meek. But Jesus had all the power and strength to resurrect from the dead. So he didn't feel like it was important to show off. He did not need to brag. When you have everything, a strong person is never going to tell you that they're a strong person. You just know. It is a weak person who tells you that they're strong. And it is a mentally weak person. And that's yeah.
I mean, you're beyond that, I know, but page 94, the last paragraph before that section,
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was so nicely written.
Do you want to read that part? What you're speaking of?
In case somebody doesn't have the book or didn't read it,
Okay.
It seems like it shouldn't be missed.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Bottom of page 94, it says, since anger is the emotion that spoils us, the Apostle Paul cautions us not to let the sun go down on your anger, which is Ephesians 4:26. And Lisa writes, nothing good will happen once anger hardens into a grudge or cements into hurt feelings. Since anger metastasizes into wrath, we must forgive each other, make amends, solve problems together, or negotiate better circumstances before anger rots us and damages our lives. New mornings have new mercies. I just thought that was so well written.
Thanks, Jane. Thank you. And you know, I write that not wondering about it. I write that knowing, yeah, anger rots and poisons you. I know that from experience. I know what bitterness is. You know, I know that it's hard to forgive. But when you can't forgive, and that doesn't mean you just let somebody back in your life to stomp all over you, but if you don't release that person from their debt, you are poisoned. You really suffer. And so that's why forgiving is important, not because it lets the other person off the hook. They know what they did, or even if they don't, God knows. But for us to gain freedom and to not be poisoned by anger and bitterness, we let that go. And that's a gift we give to ourselves. And so a wrathful person is often a person who's afraid, a person who has lots of threats. They're interpreting a lot of threats. And so a wrathful person, a person who is just prone to anger and prone to lashing out, is a person who's hurt. And that doesn't excuse it, but you know, we have to be responsible for these things. But just realize when you encounter someone like this, they're not coming from a position of strength. They're coming from a position of woundedness and problems, and they're not a strong person, you know. So Moses could get away with doing whatever he wanted because he was so big. And there's an instance where he takes 4 marauders who came to rob their place. He throws 4 grown men over his back and ties them up and carries them. What do you want me to do with these guys? What do you want me to do? And they're like, ah! And he's like, let him go. He's like, oh, all right, I'll let him go. So he lets them go, and the robbers were people who had dealt with him before. He had been their leader, and they're like, "What? We thought you were going to kill us, or really hurt us up, really hurt us bad. What happened?" And they actually wound up coming into the community because they were so struck by his change, and that he wouldn't lash back out or be like, "You're going to steal from me?" I don't think so. So he really they could tell even after just a few years how he had changed. So I just want to mention that our identity and our character can change. And sometimes it doesn't seem like this because we know that a good predictor of what someone's going to do is what they've already done, right? But it is possible. It's just not easy. And I just wanted to kind of speak about, this is a hard emotion because it wreaks so much damage. I have to go start over here. And now to acedia. So this is a word that I hadn't really encountered before I started this. And this is also one of these temptations we're all going to come across it just like we'll all come across the wrath temptation. It's slippery and it works in a few different ways. It's sort of paradoxical. And so I'll go into what it is. But first I want to mention this is John Abba. I call him wee Abba John because he's a little guy. He was probably well under 5 feet tall. So they have him standing on a rock here. And this is the tree. I don't know if you've heard from my other lesson, but this is his spiritual father, and he told him to water the stick. Water it twice a day till it bears fruit. And so that's the tree there, and that's kind of, these are people acknowledging his faithfulness. And so this is so I wind up talking about this in the book in this way, that acedia, when I'll explain what it is in a minute, but it can also involve all the other temptations. It can kind of start one way and then add different ones along the way, like wrath, like gluttony, like avarice. And it doesn't like to stay in its lane. You know, it takes up space. So we can first term this as a lack of spiritual joy. Acedia will show up in a bunch of different ways, but basically it kind of comes from this place where we don't have the spiritual joy anymore. It's more of like an apathy. And so it comes along, it'll rear its head in our lives where maybe we start on a difficult project. And we think God is in it, and I want to move in this direction, and God is in it. And then we just start to kind of poop out. And it starts to become meaningless, and we just don't see fruit for our labor, and we just stop having that joy, and we begin to be more and more apathetic. And so that's kind of how it begins to encroach. But there's other dimensions too, and I think I mentioned in another lesson that Evagrius spoke about it very specifically with the desert elders, or like the brothers and sisters that would come out to the desert. They would get bored, and he called this temptation the noonday demon, because he says, well, this really is an affliction between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. in the middle of the day. It's hot, it's boring. Instead of praying in your cell like you're supposed to be doing and reading scripture, you start moseying around, wondering what to do. I guess I'll just go over here. Maybe I'll thumb through some books. And so they're going to kind of get off track. And he's like, this is going to bother you the most during this part of the day. And you're going to want to give up and you're going to want to do something else. And you're not going to want to be disciplined and stay faithful to what you know you need to be doing. And so that's how he would see it pop up. But for us today, it pops up a little bit differently. It can come up off as restlessness and boredom. And let's see if I can read this here. So we can be plagued by the afflicting thought of acedia when we first sense a persistent feeling of malaise or meaninglessness, and this clouds our perspective. In those times, we don't exactly know what's wrong, but when it comes to acedia, but sometimes when life does not feel like a gift or a joy, acedia will tempt us into deeper feelings that everything we're working toward is now tedious and it's too difficult to continue. And we also might feel separated from God during this time and from our purpose or our communion with God. And so it's more than just boredom. It's also a disconnection from God. And so when we do that, when we kind of cooperate with that, we become more and more distant. We don't feel the communion of God anymore, that intimacy anymore. And it just kind of cascades into bigger problems, bigger and bigger things. So that's one of the ways. It can also lead to nihilism and feelings of meaninglessness. And so this can take a lot of forms. Like if you're going back to school and you're working towards a degree, or if you have a project, or let's say you want to read through the Bible in a year, just pick a difficult thing. It can eventually feel really meaningless, and you can be tempted with acedia in this case. And it is a temptation also that draws you into disconnection from God. So that's the biggest part. And it also can, not just disconnection with God, but disconnection with other people too. Okay, so this is how another way. There's a woman who is named Kathleen Norris, and she wrote a book called Acedia and Me, and she says that here's how it pops up in our culture. It's this obsession with novelty, the next new thing, or a nostalgia for the past. Oh, things were always better back in the old days, and back when I was a young person, and things were better. Things stink now. It's not so great now, or just novelty. What's the next big thing? I'm not going to really stick around to dig too deeply here. What's the next thing I can look at? And so, companies capitalize on our restlessness. They want you to be distracted. They want to capture your attention on a whole bunch of different things so that you don't stay with one thing and drill down deep. That's how we wind up seeing it in our time. And I think you might remember that I want Peter Dinklage to play Wee Abba John in the Netflix series, Should There Be One, and this is him. See, he's perfect. He's perfect. So I wanted to open this up to just a discussion here among us. In what ways do you struggle with acedia? How do you see this coming up in your life? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Or does anybody have any questions about acedia further that I didn't explain well enough?
The best word would be the word you use, apathy. That would pretty much be a summary of it. And
Yeah.
it brought to mind Francis Schaeffer commented on our culture in the 60s, I think, this book was written. He said the three things in our culture that define us and are very negative is the first one was affluence. Everything's about what I have, and my value is what I possess. Apathy, which you clearly explained, and the third one was peace at any price. As long as it's not in my backyard, I don't really care. And I think that's a pretty good summary, which your book presents many solutions to.
Yeah, and this is a common temptation that we might not have a name. We might not have a name for it, but once we have a kind of category where it fits into, you can say, I feel like a lot of us. This is going to just affect all of us somehow. You might feel like, is any of this even worth it? Is all this effort worth it? Should I even bother? It can also take place between people in relationships. Relationships are hard. They're hard to do, and it can feel tiresome. It can feel like, I don't know if or maybe like, building a relationship with your kids or with a relative, and there's problems, and you're like, do I do I give up? Is this worth it? And you feel apathetic, and you kind of encroach and kind of pull you down. And it's just something we're going to all deal with. Um, and and the answer to it isn't a complicated thing at all. It's just to persist. It's just to be faithful and to kind of double down and say, okay, I know I'm getting tempted by acedia. I know this is happening. That's okay. That's pretty normal, but I'm not going to let it beat me. I'm going to ask God for help, and I'm going to continue putting one foot in front of the other and just continue that long walk toward obedience, and just keep going. This is kind of a pep talk kind of thing. Like, it's okay to have acedia sometimes. That is going to be completely normal, but it's not okay to just give into it and just let it win and let it destroy your relationship with God, or harm it, or harm your relationship with other people. So that's one of those sneakier ones, and I don't know that we've named it very well in our time. Okay, is he cute or what? Doesn't he look like he would give good hugs? He looks like a little bit of a Santa guy. This is Macarius, and there were two Macariuses at the time. One was called Macarius the Elder or Macarius the Great, and then there was Macarius the Younger. I think they were only separated by like a couple years, but they had to distinguish them. And this is he was so beloved. He's one of the fathers that they say could do works of wonder. He could do healings. They couldn't all do that. It doesn't say they were all doing that, but he had these great spiritual abilities, and he was the one who developed the community called Sketis, I think. I'm not exactly sure if is that the name, the pronunciation of the name, but he developed this community that wound up being thousands of people in the desert, and he was their spiritual father and the founder of the community, and he was so beloved. And let's see if so Anthony the Great was sort of his spiritual predecessor, and he's the one that some people know of when they hear about the desert elders. They'll hear about that hermit Saint Anthony, and he fought the demons. We saw those images before. And when Anthony died, he passed, kind of like Elijah with Elisha, passed his mantle on. It's kind of like, you take it from here. That's what happened in his case. He was such a revered spiritual father that Anthony said, I'm dying now, but I want you to take things over from here. And so he got this mantle, like this literal passing of the torch, and his little staff or whatever, they kind of indicate that he was sort of the big daddy. And he took it from there. He's the one who actually, he baptized Abba in the day. Their lives overlapped, and I'm sure, was a great spiritual father to Abba Moses too, as Abba Moses is trying to figure out how this whole monastic thing works. He was kind and generous. They also say that his face had a glowing countenance. If we think about Moses on Mount Sinai and interacting with God, and then he came down and people saw the Shekinah glory on his face, they said that he had this kind of countenance to him, a glowing kind of countenance. So he was so saturated with the love of God and so Christ-like, and people could not leave him alone. And that's why when he decides to retire, because he's kind of like, whew, this was a lot. I'm really old now, so I'm going to go over here 25 miles away, and I'm going to dig out a new place to live. And then within that room that he dug out, he dug a little passageway cave to another little room. So people would look in and, I guess he's gone, and he'd be left to his prayers down. I think it was like a half a mile tunnel that led off from this original room. He just kept digging away. I'm going to get peace and quiet if it's the last thing I do. So he was, and this is because they loved him so much. He was such a gracious leader to them. He was such a gracious and helpful father that they just kind of kept pestering him. So he had to get away by any means necessary. That passage was a half a mile long that he dug. And I think this is ruins of his community back in Egypt. There's still, as you can see, there's like different levels. And people were sort of two to a room, and there were different buildings, and you can still go and tour it today. And so I wanted to talk about despondency, which I link with him. And there's a story in the beginning of the chapter that goes into a situation that might have felt completely hopeless. And despondency is more than sadness. So it's hopelessness and despair. And we're all going to feel this sometimes. So it's not this initial feeling that's the problem. which is just a common temptation of being human. You're going to have desperate situations. You're going to have times of great grief. That's normal to feel some despair and some hopelessness. But there is a point also when we will choose that purposefully. We'll kind of make a choice to sort of cooperate with it. And where the temptation will really trip us up. So it disturbs our peace and our connection with God. It's kind of obvious there. And then we can choose to cooperate it. So I know in my own life I've done this. I'm sure if you look over your life, were there ever times when you felt sort of despairing and hopeless, but you also felt like, well, let me just be miserable for a while. And let me hang out with people who are miserable and we can all talk about it. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. That's when it will really be an issue, is that when you decide, yeah, everything stinks. There's, and you can just go down this road and cooperate with this. And that's when it becomes sinful, because you're choosing then to kind of abandon God's hope for you and God's path for you. You're deciding, I'm just going to stay here and wallow. So that's more of what despondency is. There's this normal despondency that'll come and go perhaps once in a while in our lives. And then there's the kind that will really grab a hold of us. And I'm not connecting this with medical or clinical depression. That's something else, and that's something that can be relieved through medicine and maybe through talk therapy and healing. But this is a more like, I'm done being happy. I'm miserable and I don't care anymore. And it's really kind of sinking deep into that and embracing it. Yeah. So as we do this, as this encroaches more and more, it leads to cynicism. And weirdly, and we would not even expect this necessarily, it leads to fault finding with other people. So stuff isn't going great for you. It kind of stinks for you. And so you'll start to get nitpicky about other people's things in their lives they don't have that's going so great for them, or maybe they're doing this and they shouldn't. And we get really preoccupied with other people's problems when we don't want to deal with our own problems. And Evagrius is the one who laid it out like this. He saw this happen, and he saw how people start to think, well, I guess nothing's going to get better. I guess things are just like this. Oh, but look what he's doing over there. He's screwing things up. He's not very good at being a monastic out here. And Evagrius would see how people would start picking at each other and picking on each other. So this is a thing that we have to watch out for, because it really is damaging by this point. And this is the guy. I have his website here. He does all these woodcuts, and he did woodcuts for my book. And I thought this was really beautiful. This is Macarius and the Spirit of God. And it says, Abba Macarius. And then it says, Lord, as you know, and as you will, have mercy. And what Macarius did with his students was he would teach them simple prayers to pray when they don't have a lot of words to say. Stuff's hard, and you just need a simple prayer. And this is one of them that he would recommend. Just say, Lord, as you know, and as you will, just have mercy. It's just such it's a simple prayer, but it kind of takes care of business. It takes care of, it can work in any situation. And so that's what he would advise his students to do, to pray that prayer if they needed to, if they didn't have the words to say. So another thing that makes despondency really put its claws in us and keeps us, we find it hard to progress, or we find it hard to get out of this hole that we've dug ourselves into, is sometimes we have unattended grief and unattended sadness that is from something that happened, or just to be, this would be a surprise to no one, but I think it's worth emphasizing, is that our culture is terrible with grief, communal grief. Some of you might remember this pandemic we had, right? People died and people were harmed, and some people permanently have long COVID. But I don't sense that too many of us got together to really feel sad and sing sad songs about it, or there's not much art about what happened. There's not much expression of what happened. But this was a very trying time for worldwide for years, a couple years. And did we process that grief and those losses? My daughter was dating a guy, they didn't have prom, and that would have been a really nice thing to kind of, these markers that you wind up missing. There were people who were in old folks' homes and senior centers that could only put their hand up across the window to their relatives. And they were months and months and months without any contact with loved ones. And that's a terrible grief. That's a sadness. It's a real thing that happened. And so when we don't attend to the sadness, we don't have outlets for it and ways to feel accompanied in our sadness and in our grief, despondency can really get a hold of us and we don't even realize what's happening. It can just land us there. And as well as suffering and isolation. This happened with COVID, obviously, too. But sometimes we wind up suffering in isolation, maybe with our grief or an issue we have, and we don't bring it to anyone else. It just stays in our hearts, and this will create conditions for despondency. So we need each other, and we need to be able to speak to each other about things that are painful. So the other key aspect, whether is it despondency or is it clinical depression, right? This is a spiritual thing, not a medical or chemical thing that I'm speaking of. And it means that we feel disconnected or abandoned by God. And I think that that's, if we've lived much at all and had losses and had griefs, this has probably happened. This has probably happened that you feel disconnected or maybe even abandoned by God. And that is a normal human experience at times. But that's what despondency brings to us, is this kind of reality of like, well, I don't feel connected with God. My prayers are just bouncing off the ceiling. There's no intimacy with me and God. I feel alone. And some of those feelings of disconnection and abandonment are actually just old wounds from other people who put us in the situation, the conditions that we would feel such an isolation or a loneliness. So it's not actually about God. It's about these deeper underlying things that maybe we haven't confronted or examined very well. That was literally not helpful right there at all. So perhaps you've gone through a period of despondency. Most of us have. And if you've ever given up hope, I'm curious, is what pulled you through? Did anything pull you through when you were in despondency? Maybe you were grieving, or maybe you had a loss, or does anybody have any thoughts?
God sending a person in your life, even if it's just a neighbor or something, who maybe would just say hello or smile at you, so that you know that someone cares about you.
Yeah,
And
okay.
that God is there through them.
Yeah, relationships and our interactions make a huge difference to not have it take hold of us. Anybody else?
When this was the COVID period too,
Mm-hmm.
and I was also diagnosed with cancer, and I remember sitting in a chair, remember where I was, it kind of reflects on something you already said,
Mm-hmm.
and everything went dark. I didn't see anything. And what really pulled me through was medicine, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a lot of isolation going on
Yeah.
at that time, and what you said really came to play in all that.
Yeah, and the pandemic was like, you weren't supposed to go out. You weren't supposed to. I mean, some people did, and that's fine. But a lot of people really suffered in ways they never had before. But everybody was sort of suffering at the same time, but all alone, is what it felt like. And people were scared about getting sick and dying. That's huge. That's an existential issue. And so it was easy for despondency to take hold, but people not know what it was or know how to examine it or do anything about it. But it doesn't mean that time doesn't still sort of have its effects in us now. Like, I think it does. I think we still carry this period of time with us collectively too, is a time of pain and suffering, and some of it felt unnecessary suffering. Like, well, why is this in place? Then we can't do this. All these limitations and all these things that couldn't happen. So I think if you feel the clutches of despondency, realize that our connection to God and to others is this real lifeline to us. And it can be hard to make yourself vulnerable and reach out sometimes. But it really is God working through people to get to us. And we see God demonstrated in our friendships. That's somebody being Jesus to you coming and befriending you and walking with you through the troubling times. Okay, I hope this goes up. This is something that I found online, which is another one of Macarius's prayers. And it is just a very simple prayer. Let me just see if I can. Let me go here. What this prayer is actually is called is an arrow prayer, and it means it's just a short, quick prayer up to God. And there's different prayers, but Macarius said, I'll read what he says here. Let's see if I can. And so this is actually the last thing I'm going to do. I blew through this real quick. Let's see. Yes. So the spiritual practices that curb despondency. According to the elders, there are two categories of despondency, but they shouldn't be mistaken for each other. We already have spoken about the negative one, but the positive one is the kind of despondency that leads to repentance and that leads to generative and godly remorse and willingness to change, and it leads to life. So there's this idea, I think I might have mentioned it already, is the gift of tears, and this kind of repentance that can happen when we just kind of lay it all out for God, and we're grateful to be in God's embrace, but it's been hard, and so you might cry, as Amos Sincletica said, the gift of tears. And so the elders are sort of saying sometimes despondency can be turned around to draw us back into God in richer, deeper ways, and it is not wasted. Your pain is not wasted. That you can, so that if we sense in ourselves a sadness that is rooted in mourning over our wickedness or our mistakes, the elders agree that this is a positive emotion. Because of it, we may dare to improve. And the sadness we feel for others who are struggling from wickedness and weakness has the same good and hopeful intention. So within these hard feelings of basically good grief, we have hope that we or others can stop what we're doing and be transformed. There's a hopefulness that we can find through this avenue of despondency that we might not first appreciate. And so what is talked about in this chapter about despondency is that hope is the opposite of despair, right? So we can think of but being hopeful again. And what Macarius taught his students was to just pray, Lord, help. That's enough. That's prayer enough. Just, Lord, help. It doesn't have to be flowery or be some kind of prayer that turns this combination lock that we think God, if we say the right things or do the right things, that God will be there for us. Macarius says, just setting up an arrow prayer, God, help. Lord, help me. That's enough. And our desire to find the peace of God again is honored, that God honors those prayers. And so I wound up finding this thing about this prayer, and I hope it comes out, but I'm wondering, let's see. I'll put it up loud. And what it is people singing his prayer. And it's also spoken. And so the singing's in the background. We'll see how it goes, because I don't know how it'll go, but let's see.
Lord, there is no need at all to make long discourses. It is enough to stretch out one's hands and say, Lord, as you will and as you know, have mercy. And if the conflict grows fiercer, say, Lord, help. God knows very well what we need and shows us mercy. Lord, have mercy.
So those were monks praying that prayer. And monks today pray the prayer of Abba Macarius. And I think if you just pray, Lord, have mercy, that can be enough. I actually am going to be winding up ending a little early today, but I think that's all right. And if there's anybody who has any questions about anything, you let me know. Let's see. Lord, as you will and as you know, have mercy. Or, Lord, help. And we remember Lord, help from Peter when he was on the waves. He just cried out to God as he was sinking, Lord, help. Did you want to say something, Tim?
Yeah, what do you suggest for better communal grief in our society?
Yeah, I think that's extremely important to encounter that, especially if you lead anyone, if you have any influence over people. I think the Psalms, the lamenting Psalms, are a huge source, and they have been for how many millennia for the Jewish people, where they will sing the Psalms together, these heartbroken Psalms, and even the imprecable Psalms, the cursing Psalms, where it sounds awful sometimes that your enemies have their children's head dashed on rocks. It sounds so horrible. But when you say those things that you feel and not do them, I like put it in God's hands, but you're allowed to have all of those emotions and feelings. And I believe a community saying these prayers at once, walking alongside each other through pain and through grief, is an enormous benefit that I don't know that in our individualistic culture we pay that much heed to or that much mind to. I think that it is like in Jewish tradition, they sit Shiva in grief. Does anybody familiar with this? You can speak to this, right?
Yes. In the Jewish, I'll stand up so everybody can hear me. In the Jewish faith, when someone passes away, they sit what they call Shiva for 7 days. They sit on wooden stools. All the mirrors in the house are covered. And every morning and every night, I believe, they need 10 men to come in and have what they call a minyan, and it's a prayer time, morning and night. I know when my dad passed away, and I forget which tribe of Israel my dad belonged to, but he was shrouded like Jesus was shrouded when Jesus was put in the tomb.
Mhm.
My dad was shrouded when he was put in his coffin, and that's how he was in his coffin. He also did have a military, there were military people there because he was in the Second World War. But the Jewish people do that, and they cover everything up, and people come and visit. There are no flowers. If you want to give something to someone who is a family of someone who has passed away in the Jewish faith, you send fruit. You send something that they can eat. The flowers will eventually die, and that is only, it will sadden the people even more and remind them that their loved one has passed away. So I can remember going to many Jewish homes as a kid, and everyone was sitting on these low stools. They wear a piece of black ribbon that is torn on their clothing, and it demonstrates that a part of them has been torn apart and torn away. But to me, once those 7 days are over, everybody leaves, and there's the family left still with that grief. So there are good things and there are bad things, I guess.
Yeah.
But that's what it is. They sit what they call Shiva. They sit and they pray. And the mirrors are covered in the home. It's just, it's a custom.
Right. So that's an example, and there are other examples too. A friend of mine, that certain cultures kind of get this more. In the Irish culture, there's something called keening. Is anybody aware of what keening is? And it's this wailing. It's this wailing that happens, and even people will. This happens in other cultures too. It's just a time where you can really express, you can really cry out and be in pain, and it's socially acceptable, and nobody's going to say like, "Shh, stop, you're embarrassing me." You really sit with the sadness, and not for an evening, for days, because that's how important it is. And we know when we lose someone, that hole is just blown out of our life, never to be fixed. We can, in a sense, on the inside, kind of increase so that hole seems smaller in comparison, but there isn't any replacing anyone we've lost. Once we're connected with them, there isn't a replacing them. And so we know that our grief, and grief is often shown to be very similar as separation anxiety, with the same kind of internal emotions that people feel when they have separation anxiety. It's because there's been a separation. But a lot of times we don't spend the time.
I just want to say, living in Africa,
Yes.
where I lived, the village was right down below us. And when someone died, you would hear that keening, the people just crying out. And I asked someone, that's the way they show their grief. So that's just another example.
And if you ever see, this happens in places in Egypt, in Arabia, and you'll see like in Gaza, in places where there have been bombings, and people are, and they'll carry them, and they'll just be weeping openly, and they'll just be crying out, and this can go on for a while as they're able to really sit with the pain for a while. We don't want to sit with the pain. We want to, okay, that happened, but let's just move on. Let me get busy again so I don't have to think about it. But not sitting with it means we're just doomed to feel it again. We're doomed to enact violence on others, or lash out in ways that's repressed because it comes out as something else, then some other emotion. And the Taiwanese people are really good at having a whole group of people that sometimes are hired, and they cry out near the house. They cry out about the pain of losing this person. And other cultures, America has a sort of a recent culture, you could say. It's a lot of different groups of people from different places in the world kind of starting something new here. And I don't know that we have like the heft of some of these civilizations that have been there for millennia, and they've figured out how to grieve without letting it turn into harming other people. But there's plenty of cultures that do this so much better than us, that we could just learn from and we could take pieces from. And it's that we don't suffer in isolation and grieve alone. And when a whole community does it, like the Jewish people, the Psalms are for just that. They're for different times, different occasions, and you sing and sing these song prayers out loud together, and you go through it together. You know, I think if we don't do that, we see a lot more strange things, like children killing each other at school, stuff like that. Where do you think that comes from? We've never dealt with our pain and our grief and our violence. So kids think, I can kill. It is this is not happening in other places. There aren't school killings in other countries. And we have a lot of unprocessed stuff, and it can ruin us, Did you? Yeah.
I was just thinking, I read recently where Mother Teresa said that one of the horrible things about our culture is the loneliness that we have, because we're so separated, and all the distractions, the screens, and all that stuff. But going back to your comments on despondency, for me, nighttime sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I can feel it in my gut where I'm heading toward just negativity and fear and all that stuff. And, some of one of the things is to maybe recite the 23rd Psalm or pray the Jesus prayer, which is very close to what you just expressed there. But I think the nighttime attack is one of the favorite ones of Satan.
Yes.
Your
reserves are down,
defenses are down.
yeah.
And, one of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 16, where David says, I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, my whole being rejoices, my flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy, and at your right hands are pleasures forevermore. Now, how could that night buoy you up?
Gotta help. That's gotta help.
So I think that's we have always the option to focus our minds in a certain direction.
Yeah.
And there are some things we should not focus on, fear and all this negative stuff.
Yeah, and it taking hold. Yeah.
Reoriented.
Yes.
The good news.
Yeah, I wanted to, just 1 second, I will get to you in a second, Norma, but I wanted to just reiterate, this also comes from, I believe, like recovery programs. This is the word halt. And some of you might know this. So if things are not too good, check and see if you're hungry, if you're angry, if you're tired, or if you're lonely. Some of the worst decisions, some of the worst trains of thought and going down these roads can't happen, can't take hold if we are seeing first, have I had enough food recently? Am I like, isn't it a hangry bad place right now? And we can kind of reflect a little bit and see maybe there's other things at issue, and maybe this doesn't have to take hold like it is. You want to say?
Well, I was just thinking about our granddaughter and her husband and our great grandson who passed so suddenly. And so just like Steve said, you focus on the psalm to bring it out of that. One of the assignments they had from their very wise counselor, which again in our culture is every day take an hour at very intentionally. And I remember because I was there watching their the baby, and they would go up to Cullen's room, and I want you to just look at everything that's going to cause you to feel sad. I want you to go there every single day and know that, so that they're not hijacked with that any other time. But they know I'm going to have this. There's a lot of grieving there. But again, to your point, Tim, that's not something that we typically tell people to do. But just like we have to visit for hope to the word, we have to visit the grief and allow ourselves to feel it. And anything that would make them cry, anything that's going to be that tactile thing. That took weeks, months.
I think it's Mr. Rogers said, all our feelings are mentionable and manageable. He was my spiritual father. He was my spiritual father. But that's true. You can mention the feelings that you have if you even know what they are. Sometimes we don't quite know because we've been too busy avoiding them. But we can mention them and we can manage them because God is there to help us. And there isn't anything that Jesus experienced that wasn't something that we will experience. Jesus was abandoned by all his best friends when he needed them the most. And he must have felt so, not just betrayed, but isolated and abandoned and hopeless for a little bit, and Jesus knows that, and we can take those things to Jesus. But I do think that, as Tim has mentioned, like, how do we do this together? And I've been asked this, and when I've been interviewed about the book, like pastors have asked me, like, what should we do? And I'm like, if you're wondering if you should do something, but you feel like you should, step out and take that first step and, ask a few people to join you. Maybe in some traditions, they do something like hold vigil. So they just have a candle and they just stand there. Maybe they recite a prayer or a hymn. They're all standing in solidarity together and they're saying, this has meant something. Something happened and it's painful. And we have to stay here with it, or it's going to pop out in weird ways with other people later, in ways we're not able to identify it anymore. It'll just come out and be harmful. But if we stay there with our pain for a while and we're like, we're going to be okay. This hurts so bad. This is so awful and so painful. I don't want to feel it, but I'm going to let myself feel it because I know it is manageable. It is going to be okay. We're going to make it. We're going to take the next step. We're going to make it through, and we're going to all make it through together. And nobody gets left back. Nobody gets left behind. But that is a real thing that leadership has to do, or maybe a groundswell, grassroots thing has to happen as well. But that if we feel that is a need, that we take a step out in obedience and see that God will step with us. So we will step out, and if God is calling you, I feel like something should happen because of some kind of event or some old pain or something like this, that we do something about it, because this is a particular frailty of our culture specifically, and we're truly one of the most violent cultures in the history of humankind, with the capability to inflict so much harm. And so how are we going to deal with our pain that we have? How? So I'll leave you with that. And I think this has been just such a great time. It can be hard to talk about the painful things, the grief and the despondency. It can be very hard. But we also know that God is with us and God strengthens us into Christ's likeness. And there is a resurrection, right? So there's the death. We go through the death. We go through it, and then we come out the other side. And the resurrection, not by avoiding the death. You can only get to the resurrection by going to the dark place, to the place of death first. So I'll just give us a little prayer to get us going. And I'm so grateful and thankful that I can exchange some of these ideas with you. Just staying and writing the book is an isolating experience, but speaking with you really makes it come alive for me. So Lord Jesus, we thank you for your going through death to be resurrected so that you are leading the way for us. And I ask that we come alongside each other in our pain, that we find ways to walk together through the good times, but also through the very hard times. And I thank you for these beautiful people here who have such a heart for you. And I ask that your spirit will be upon us and that you will give us peace. Lord, help us. In Jesus' name we ask, amen.